I don't care for this website Salon because it's left-wing. It's really a hack operation. And yet here I am. I see an interesting story in there because Steve Kornacki, their news director, I guess, is unleashing on Anthony Weiner. But there's something very interesting about this, beyond the current controversy. I learned something about Weiner in this piece that may actually interest you. And he explains that Anthony Weiner became a New York City councilman and would set him up to be a congressman because of a very, very filthy trick. He writes, you can certainly make a compelling case that Weiner should not have to give up his seat in Congress or his career in elected politics because of the online photo scandal that has engulfed him this week. This is how the hard left thinks. So what? His whatchamahoozy was all over the place. Hell, we do that all the time. He goes on, but if this does end up being the end of Weiner's public career, it might not be quite the injustice it seems like, at least if you know how his career began. 20 years ago, Weiner was a young aide to an ambitious, still somewhat obscure Brooklyn congressman named Charles Schumer. After working in Washington a few years, Weiner had been dispatched to Sheepshead Bay to run Schumer's local office. It was Schumer's idea, and Weiner had told him that he wanted to enter politics and was considering moving to Florida, where the 1990 census would soon produce several new congressional seats in areas where a New York transplant with the name Weiner could probably do well. Schumer said he was better off returning to Brooklyn, where Weiner was from originally, and establishing himself there. Weiner's opening came in 1991, when the city council was radically expanded from 35 to 51 seats. One of the new districts, the 48th, would be in southern Brooklyn. It was a neat match for Weiner. The new seat was in the heart of Schumer's district. There was no incumbent. The population was heavily Jewish. Weiner jumped into the race. He was not the favorite. Two other candidates with more name recognition, deeper ties to the community, stronger organizational support, and bigger bankrolls seemed to have the inside track. Michael Garson, the candidate of the Brooklyn Democratic Organization, and Adele Cohen, the favorite of a progressive labor coalition that backed candidates across the city in 1991. It was a low-profile race, but Weiner attracted positive reviews, aggressively campaigning and using his performer's flair to steal the show at debates and candidate forums. But as the all-important September 10 Democratic primary approached, the consensus was that he'd come up short, and that, as Newsday put it in an editorial endorsing one of his opponents, he should try again next time. It was at this point that Weiner's campaign decided to blanket the district with leaflets attacking his opponents. But these were no ordinary campaign attacks. They played the race card, and at a very sensitive time. They were also anonymous. Gee, they play the race card on themselves, these liberals. Just weeks earlier, the Crown Heights riot, a deadly days-long affair that brought to the surface long-standing tension between the area's black and Jewish populations, had played out a few miles away from the 48th District. The episode had gripped all of New York and had been national news. You all remember this. It was just days after order had been restored that Weiner's campaign distributed its anonymous leaflets, which linked Cohen, whose voters he was targeting in particular, to Jesse Jackson and David Dinkins, who was then New York's mayor. It's hard to imagine two more hated political figures in the 48th District at that moment. Jackson, just a few years earlier, had called New York Hymietown, and it was an article of faith among white voters in Weiner's part of Brooklyn that Dinkins had protected the black rioters in Crown Heights, and thus endangered the white population by refusing to order a harsh police crackdown. Of course, 2 years later, Dinkins would lose to Rudy Giuliani by an 80 to 20% in the 48th District. The leaflets urged voters to just say no to the Jackson-Dinkins agenda that Cohen supposedly represented. At City Hall, Dinkins held up the flyer and branded it hateful. It's impossible to say what precise effect this all had on the election, but it clearly didn't hurt Weiner. In a surprise result, Weiner finished in first place. 125 votes, a mere 125 votes ahead of Garson, and only 195 votes ahead of Cohen. Only after the ballots were counted did Weiner admit that he'd been behind the leaflets, claiming that, quote, "we didn't want the source to be confused with the message." This prompted an editorial rebuke from the New York Slimes, which noted that Mr. Weiner's hit-and-run tactics tarnish his come-from-behind campaign. Never stopped them from endorsing him for Congress, though. Not that it mattered. The primary was over, and Weiner had won. The general election was a formality. And months later, he became the youngest city council member in the history of New York City. And 7 years after that, he parlayed his council spot into a seat in Congress. And you know the story from there. So Weiner, race baiting and lying to win his first public office. His mentor throughout it all, including his runs for Congress, Chuck Schumer. The guy's always been a sleazeball, and so is his mentor, by the way, Schumer. These pukes, that's right, I said it. These pukes will do anything for power. Anything. Anything to get it, anything to keep it, anything to exercise it over us. And they both support Obamacare. And yes, they are linked. They are ruthless, power-hungry political hacks. Let me be so bold as to say, oh, dare I? Yes. They can give a damn about this country. They only care about their own fate, their own careers, their own aggrandizement. They are not the kind of public figures that the Founding Fathers had in mind. And in my humble opinion, looking at what they've already done, these hardcore leftists, and that is what Weiner is, and that is what Schumer is. They've already done enormous damage to this country, to this society, which it will be very difficult to unravel, if not, truthfully, impossible at one day. And yet they want us to speak of them in honorable terms. They attack us when we say they don't support the Constitution, when in fact they seek to transform the society. You can't have it both ways. Weiner is a disgusting human being, well beyond having to do with his recent conduct. It's what he's doing to your children and my children. It's what that whole party is doing to your children and my children, because that party has been taken over by the 1960s rioters, the 1960s protesters, and their progeny. That's correct. These are not traditional Democrats. They are not. They are wrecking balls.